Now, the annual climate change conference in Dubai saw a landmark decision to transition away from fossil fuels to reach net zero emissions by the year 2050. COP28 was held from the 30th of November and ended in mid-December. This is a gathering that saw fierce debates around whether to completely phase out fossil fuels or phase down of the resources. With South Africa's Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan now complete, the Global Warming Summit's key objectives must now be executed through our domestic policy. Newzroom Afrika's Ziyanda Ngcobo was at the Expo City in Dubai and paints a picture of what the next 7 years will look like.
This year's Conference of the Parties concluded a day after it was scheduled to end, as talks over whether to completely do away with fossil fuels became a focal point. Delegates resolved to transition away from oil, gas and other natural resources and close the gaps to 2030 after doing a global stocktake since the Paris Agreement. But for South Africa and the rest of Africa, there's been a resistance towards ditching fossil fuels without a commitment from wealthier nations to pay for being the biggest transgressors, yet the impact is felt here on the mother continent. My colleague Ngcobo has looked at how South Africa's coal power plants fare on the global stage.
The Global West is revitalizing efforts to reduce carbon emissions from fossil fuels, but this time around it wants global nations like South Africa on board to realize gains in the near future.
Measures to reduce emission by over 60% by 2050 can save $22 trillion, reduce peak load demand by 1.5 to 2 terawatts.
Global carbon budgets forecast emissions from fossil fuels to total 36.8 billion tons this year, a 1.1% jump from 2022. It highlights that while the United States, China and Europe remain the top emitters, progress has been made towards sustainable reductions. On the other hand, Africa's economic powerhouse was among the nations to pledge to reduce its emissions by between 350 and 420 million metric tons by 2030 at the Paris Climate Summit in 2015. The utility sector is cited as one of the main contributors to carbon emissions around the world, and Africa is no different. South Africa is the main culprit on the continent, with Eskom's aging power stations fueling the incline. Eskom's almost $500 million Just Energy Transition Plan was approved by the World Bank last year and informs the utility on how to go about decommissioning the 56-year-old Komati coal-fired power plant and other aging stations, as well as repurpose the project area with renewable energy batteries. Climate Action 100+'s assessments shows a failure so far. However, Mineral Resources and Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe warns that the country can't sprint away from coal without proper research and development.
Everybody, even those who are actually propagating it as a good example of just energy transition, are now admitting that Komati power station experiment was a disaster. Therefore, we must draw lessons out of that and not just run and collapse power stations without doing a proper study. Actually, there is pressure on the other side that says we must extend lives of the power stations so that we don't collapse supply.
Mantashe further sounds the alarm on the importance of African nations having the freedom to implement their own sovereign energy plans and not to be dictated by the West, that is, in fact, reversing back to coal.
I built 43 new coal power stations last year. Japan built 23 new coal power stations. India is increasing its use of coal power. We're put under pressure. We're only running 14 power stations. So therefore that pressure is on the weakest and actually on the poorest.
The Orlando Towers is an example of how decommissioned coal-fired power stations can be repurposed. But when we turn our attention to the rest of the continent, the conversation moves away from coal to oil and gas.
The transition, oil and gas will remain for quite a long time, and so we need absolutely to produce oil and gas in a different way by slashing down emissions, and we can do it.
Sasol mines coal in South Africa, produces gas in Mozambique and oil in Gabon. and is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the country. Its Executive Vice President of Sustainability and Integrated Services, Vuyo Kahla, says their decarbonization journey is complex.
If you take, for example, in relation to Sasol, we are in the hard-to-abate sectors. We involve in a coal-to-liquids process that has a high intensity in respect of carbon.
They too have set themselves ambitious targets.
That by leading to 2030, we will reduce our own coal intake by a quarter and start bringing in energy sources or feedstocks with lower carbon intensity.
The debate continues to rage on at COP28 as just how far the continent should move away from fossil fuels to greener energy.
You'd have heard Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe referring to the decommissioning of Komati power plants in Mpumalanga as a disaster. Newzroom Afrika's Mweli Masilela focused on the negative health impact the plant's existence has had on nearby communities, while others decried the loss of jobs.
Life is tough for the fragile and young in Emalahleni due to air pollution caused by mining houses as well as power stations in Mpumalanga. Mbali Matebula, who resides in Fosman, just outside Emalahleni city center, says her 9-year-old daughter has been suffering from chronic asthma for 5 years. She says her daughter's medical practitioner informed her that the child's health condition might be caused by dirty air of Emalahleni.
Sometimes I can't sleep because of her, and now she's using a nebulizer. So there is a load shedding sometimes, so I must go to hospital sometimes. Her life is not good because of this air pollution. She can stay maybe 2 weeks fine, but a week next she's going to be sick. She's not a normal child.
Matebula says mining companies operating in their area hardly help when cold.
Living near the mines, so we have many mines, but they don't assist us with anything. They don't even come here and check whether people are happy or what. They don't care. So there are many people who are sick because of this mine. So we as parents, we must make a plan for our children to go to hospital.
A sentiment shared by Ntombi Maphosa, an attorney at the Center for Environmental Rights. She's been working with a number of climate change activists for over a year now to try and get justice for affected community members such as Mbali Matebula.
Different experts to look at this issue, different health experts, and most of the issues relate to respiratory illnesses, so chronic asthma, pulmonary disease, and so on. But much of the impact is felt especially on vulnerable people, so children and the elderly people and people that already have coexisting diseases. So that is like most of the issue, and it's compounded also by the fact that the clinics and public health care facilities are not really equipped to be able to deal with the issues. So it all, creates sort of this crisis for people that have to live in this area.
Some non-profit organizations in Emalahleni and surrounding areas are now calling for a shift from coal-fired power generation to renewable energy and urging residents to stand up for their rights.
We want them to know that what action they can take to the polluters, because of what we believe is people, they say lung cancers or other diseases, it's something like family diseases, but we don't believe in that. We say it's something that is impacted from the industries.
As much as many people concur that the issue of air pollution should be dealt with, moving from coal to renewable energy has proven to be disastrous for many community members. Many have lost their jobs and businesses after the decommissioning of Komati Power Station in October last year.
kakhulu ngoba thina besisebenza ngoboya lapha besivala loboya amapipe ukuthi angashisi so besivala wona ngaloboya, and then bese senze sheet metal. Umsebenzi wethu bekuyi sheet metal. So kwaphela ke lokho umsebenzi thena kuphela kwathi unama-job azobakhona till manje ayikho into engathi kuyacaca.
Ngize kakhulu ukuvalwa kwe-power station ngoba siyintsha la ekumati. Imisebenzi kahle siyayidinga kakhulu. Uma singasebenzi impilo inzima kakhulu ngoba siphila nge-350. I-350 ayikhona ukuthi isenzele izidingo zethu, ayikhona ukuthi sikhona ukuthi sibhadale ama-rent la sihlala khona sithenge nokudla.
Kakhulu baba ukuvalwa kwe-power station ngoba njengathi nje emzileni emkhakheni wamatekisi besikhona nokusebenza ukuthi sikhona ukulayisha abantu sithola nomsebenzi itafu kumele kuvalwa nje power station vele hawo nabantu.
Those advocating for a pollution-free world are hoping that representatives of different countries who will be gathering in Dubai for COP28 will come up with concrete plans to deal with issues of climate change, while those relying on coal mining activities are hoping that resolutions taken will not affect their jobs and businesses.
When we return, we look at how the Dubai Conference of the Parties was a first when it comes to food systems and how they contribute towards carbon emissions. Welcome back. The last few days of COP28 saw fierce debates around the wording of the final agreement. The gathering, which was meant to conclude on the 12th of December, continued on the 13th as oil and gas-rich countries pushed back against a complete phase-out of non-renewables. Let's listen in on what was said on the very last day as delegates raced against time to put the summit to bed. The final agreement from COP28 is unlikely to be concluded anytime soon as oil and gas-rich countries remain resolute that phasing down fossil fuel is the best way forward for all. But on the other hand, climate change activists, including UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, believe the only way to arrest the situation is through phasing out those resources. On the final day of the conference, leaders were still calling for a compromise.
What we've seen since is that the parties have deeply held and deeply split views, especially on the language around fossil fuels. It's important to be clear on something. The text we released was a starting point for discussions. Again, this is entirely normal for a consensus-based process. When we released it, we knew opinions were polarized, but what we didn't know was where each country's red lines were. By releasing our first draft of the text, we got parties to come to us quickly with those red lines. We spent last night talking, taking in that feedback, and that has put us in a position to draft a new text. The text includes all the elements we need for a comprehensive plan to 2030. It's all there. Mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation and loss and damage. And we've been seeking the right balance between those elements.
The African Group of Negotiators on Climate Change, which prepare and draft texts on behalf of the continent's heads of state, has lamented how there's been a failure to live up to the global goals on adaptation. The negotiators have called for the final text to put timeframes and plans in place for when the money to transition will be operationalized and move beyond just pledges.
The GST outcome, therefore, must promote equity and fairness in the allocation of policy space and ensure that the energy transition will be just, that it will be equitable and orderly. As such, the transition should be premised on differentiated pathways to net zero and fossil fuel phase down. It should also recognize the full right for Africa to exploit its natural resources sustainably and in line with sustainable development and poverty eradication needs.
Nigeria's Environmental Affairs Minister has intimated that for his country, fossil fuels will be around for a long while.
Science has established that if you stop breathing without life support, you will die. Asking Nigeria to phase out fossil fuel, or indeed Africa to phase out fossil fuel, is asking us to stop breathing without life support.
The COP28 presidency has been working day and night throughout the summit, meeting with countries, trying to find a consensus on what the final document will say regarding our goals in the next 7 years and ultimately our 2050 targets when it comes to carbon emissions. Whether or not this will be achieved without further polarizing an already tense geopolitical environment is the test for this United Arab Emirates nation, which has already dubbed this gathering as a success. For Newzroom Afrika on Channel 405, I'm Ziyanda Ngcobo, wrapping up at Expo City in Dubai. One of the firsts at the conference is the emphasis placed on the environmental impact of food and specifically animal agriculture on global warming. According to a 2021 study, the food system accounts for more than a third of the world's greenhouse emissions, but its effects have largely been ignored. One South African non-profit organization calls for cutting down on meat consumption as a part of efforts to save the environment. We're at the Agri-Food Pavilion where food systems are forming part of the discussions here at COP28. It's the first time that the Conference of Parties actually dedicates an entire day towards discussing this matter in relation, of course, to climate change. And one such organization that also has its own small pavilion within the much larger one is ProVeg. You have a Food for Climate Pavilion, which is discussing what exactly, Donovan Will?
So what we want to do is really just explain to people that the food we eat has a really big impact on climate. 33% of the greenhouse gas emissions is coming from the agricultural sector, and 20% of that is from livestock. And up until now, countries aren't including it in the NDCs. We're not talking about it as a mitigating strategy for climate change.
How do you tell someone like me to stop eating meat, Donovan, and why?
So I think that's a big misconception. We're really telling South Africans to eat less. We know if we look at the average meat consumption in South Africa, it's just too much. It's too high. The greenhouse gas emissions are really high. And the land use, we're using, around the world, we're using 80% of the land, the agricultural land, for animals, but we're only getting a small amount of total calories and total protein from there. It'll be a lot more efficient for us to just use that land and for humans to be eating more plant-rich diets.
Okay, so what is the solution? More plants, less livestock? How do you change the entire ecosystem to work in that way?
Well, we're very excited to see that there's been a declaration on sustainable agriculture. Unfortunately, South Africa hasn't signed onto it yet, but we're hoping that they will. And I think that's the first step, to just let people know that this is happening. The food we eat has an impact on the environment. The food we eat has an impact on our health. The food we eat has an impact on food justice, on food availability, and eating more plant-rich food is the solution. It's like our grandparents told us, eat your veggies.
I mean, explain the science in a very simple way. So you're basically saying we're using too much land for livestock as opposed to vegetables. Is that the only way in which we're contributing towards the fossil fuels?
So there's so many things that are contributing. You know, there are the fossil fuels, there's aviation, there's maritime transport, there's big industry, and all of those things have been discussed. And we're just saying that plant-based food is a strategy that we can use. And if we want to get to the target and keep that in range, the 1.5, we have to look at all of the solutions that we have. And one of the solutions is definitely eating more plant-rich food.
While discussions continued with ministers and negotiators, climate activists also wanted to use the global stage to highlight human rights violations by the COP28 host nation.
What we want to do is really just explain to people that the food we eat has a really big impact on climate. 33% of the greenhouse gas emissions is coming from the agricultural sector, and 20% of that is from livestock. And up until now, countries aren't including it in the NDCs. We're not talking about it as a mitigating strategy for climate change.
How do you tell someone like me to stop eating meat, Donovan, and why?
So I think that's a big misconception. We're really telling South Africans to eat less. We know if we look at the average meat consumption in South Africa, it's just too much. It's too high. The greenhouse gas emissions are really high. And the land use, we're using, around the world, we're using 80% of the land, the agricultural land, for animals, but we're only getting a small amount of total calories and total protein from there. It'll be a lot more efficient for us to just use that land and for humans to be eating more plant-rich diets.
Okay, so what is the solution? More plants, less livestock? How do you change the entire ecosystem to work in that way?
But we're very excited to see that there's been a declaration on sustainable agriculture. Unfortunately, South Africa hasn't signed onto it yet, but we're hoping that they will. And I think that's the first step, to just let people know that this is happening. The food we eat has an impact on the environment, the food we eat has an impact on our health, the food we eat has an impact on food justice, on food availability, and eating more plant-rich food is the solution. It's like our grandparents told us, eat your veggies.
I mean, explain the science in a very simple way. So you're basically saying we're using too much land for livestock as opposed to vegetables. Is that the only way in which we're contributing towards the fossil fuels?
So there's so many things that are contributing. You know, there are the fossil fuels, there's aviation, there's maritime transport, there's big industry, and all of those things have been discussed. And we're just saying that plant-based food is a strategy that we can use. And if we want to get to the target and keep that in range, to 1.5, we have to look at all of the solutions that we have. And one of the solutions is definitely eating more plant-rich food.
I wonder then if that will help transform someone like me into becoming a vegan. Not quite. Donovan Will is with Pro-Veg. He's here at the Agri-Food Pavilion talking about food systems. You've just heard him reflecting on how using too much land for livestock, and that's contributing to our fossil fuels and, of course, the carbon emissions. For Newzroom Afrika on Channel 405, I'm Ziyanda Ngcobo at Expo City in Dubai. While discussions continued with ministers and negotiators, climate activists also wanted to use the global stage to highlight human rights violations by the COP28 host nation. Human Rights Watch is one of the non-profit organizations that's keenly watching the developments taking place here at COP28, and of particular interest for this NPO is the issue of the phasing out of fossil fuels and the civil rights issues in the United Arab Emirates. In fact, coming into this COP28, Joey Shea, you have actually spoken about ending the human rights abuses taking place here in the UAE, and that this must be on the agenda at COP28. Why have you chosen to take up this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So the UAE over the past decade has engaged in a sustained assault on basic rights and freedoms. They've criminalized the right to protest, the right to speak freely, the right to organize a civil society organization, an independent environmental group. So we have been calling on UAE authorities to end these restrictions on basic rights and freedoms, and we've also been calling on other governments in attendance of COP28 to pressure the Emirati government into creating more space for freedom of expression, assembly, and association. One of the cases that we've been following very closely over the past decade is the case of Ahmed Mansour, who was the last openly working human rights defender in the UAE. And right now he is sitting in Al Sadr prison, which is just 45 minutes away from where we are today in Dubai Expo City. Human Rights Watch has been calling for his immediate and unconditional release. Unfortunately, we have not seen that, and unfortunately, many governments in attendance of COP28 have been shamefully silent on the need for his release.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the other things was as recently as 2 days ago, I think there was an issue around whether people would even be able to protest here at COP28 and the permissions around that. What's to be said about this in light of what you've just mentioned about Ahmed Mansour?
It's extremely restrictive at this COP28 in terms of protest rights. You can only protest safely within the blue zone, which is where we are right now. It's the UN special zone that is governed by UNFCCC rules and regulations. The moment you step outside into the green zone and beyond, you are subject to national Emirati laws, which criminalize protests and other basic rights. So we have been warning climate activists who are attending COP28 to be extremely careful with where they are expressing themselves and to only express themselves within this safe blue zone. Even within the blue zone, it has been very challenging to get certain protest actions approved, and because this is the only space where people can safely express themselves, it's been very, limiting for all those in attendance.
What about the expression then about phasing out fossil fuels, which is a topic that is currently on the agenda? In fact, there's a strong push for either the phasing down or even completely ditching fossil fuels as being one of the key outcomes of this COP28.
At Human Rights Watch, we are demanding that the phase out of fossil fuels is included in the concluding document of COP28. We're hoping to see that happen, but it's very challenging in this environment. We have Sultan Ahmed Ngcobo, the head of COP28, who is also the head of ADNOC, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and we have been documenting over a series of many months that the UAE is using COP28 as a means of burnishing its image while continuing to push for the expansion of fossil fuels. So those interests are clearly, colliding in this moment, but we're still hopeful that that fossil fuel reference will be included in the concluding document.
All right, Joey Shine, she speaks for Human Rights Watch, and hope. That's mainly what a lot of lobbyists, NPOs, and even our very own South African government are pinning, on in terms of being able to get a feasible, viable outcome at a COP28. The issue around the global goal on adaptation and climate financing is expected to take center stage at the 29th Conference of the Parties in Azerbaijan. For Newzroom Afrika on Channel 405, I'm Ziyanda Ngcobo in Johannesburg.